Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's obviously an honor to be introduced by Kay Barnes, but it's also an honor to be asked to speak at the Kansas City Public Library. And I am thrilled to be here and thrilled to be part of this tremendous series on the presidents, Hail to the Chiefs. And I hope you'll try to go to all of the lectures. I know they're going to be fascinating. And I'm very grateful to all of you for coming tonight. At heart, this book is not about politics or science or even the shooting of a president. It's about an extraordinary drama that took place inside the White House over 80 days. In the 130 years since Garfield's death, the story of his assassination has been largely forgotten. But even at the time, even though the entire nation, the world really, was watching, no one really understood what was happening. What began as a shooting became a bitter struggle over personal power and ambition. And the result was the brutal death of one of our most promising leaders at the hands of his own physicians. This is an intimate, heartbreaking story of ignorance versus science and greed versus heroism. James Garfield was not, as he has been largely remembered to be, just a bland, bearded 19th century politician. On the contrary, he was one of the most extraordinary men ever elected president. Although he was born into desperate poverty, he was our last president, born in a log cabin. He didn't have shoes until he was 4 years old, and this is in Ohio. He became a professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages by the time he was a sophomore in college. By the time he was 26, he was a university president. He was an incredible classicist. He knew the entire Aeneid by heart in Latin. And while he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. To me, though, what is more impressive and more inspirational even than Garfield's brilliance was his decency. My first book was about Theodore Roosevelt, and I have great admiration for him. He was a firebrand, the hero, the center of every drama. But that's not Garfield. Garfield was the calmest, wisest man in the room. He was a good, kind, honest man who was genuinely trying to do the right thing. He was a real person, not consumed by ego and ambition. Even after 17 years in Congress, in one of the most ruthless, vicious eras of machine politics, Garfield never changed. His friends used to marvel at his patience and forbearance, even in the face of the most brutal personal attacks. But Garfield was incapable of holding a grudge. He used to shrug and say, "I'm a poor hater." Although Garfield took his presidency very seriously, he had never had what he called presidential fever. In fact, he never ran for any office. He refused to campaign, and he always made it clear that he was going to follow his own conscience and convictions, and if people didn't agree with him, they shouldn't vote for him. When Garfield went to the Republican convention in the summer of 1880, not only was he not a candidate, he didn't even want to be one. He had gone there to give a speech nominating another man. The convention was in this enormous hall in Chicago. There were 15,000 people there, and the favorite to win by far was Ulysses S. Grant, who was hoping for a third term in the White House. And in the midst of the chaos and noise of this convention, Garfield got up to speak. And that speech was so powerful and so eloquent and extemporaneous that the hall slowly quieted until all you could hear was Garfield's voice. Everyone was just riveted. They were spellbound. And at one point, Garfield said, "Gentlemen, I ask you, what do we want?" And someone in the crowd shouted, "We want Garfield." And the whole hall just went crazy. And when the balloting began, delegates began casting their ballot for Garfield, even though, again, he wasn't even a candidate. And he stood up and he objected and he tried to stop what was happening, but he couldn't. And what started as a trickle became a stream, became a river, became a flood of votes, until finally Garfield found himself the Republican nominee for President of the United States. What I found again and again and again while I was researching this book is that not only was Garfield's life and his nomination and his brief presidency incredible, but the people surrounding him were equally unbelievable. You just couldn't make them up. First, of course, there was Charles Guiteau, Garfield's would-be assassin. Guiteau was a deeply, dangerously delusional man, but he was very intelligent and he was incredibly articulate. If you read nearly any other account of Garfield's assassination, it will refer to Guiteau as a disgruntled office seeker, but that doesn't cover the smallest fraction of it. Guiteau was a uniquely American character. He was a product of this country at that time. It was a time when there was a lot of play in the joints, and there was no one to really understand what he was up to and hold him to account for it. Guiteau was a self-made madman. He was smart and scrappy. He was a clever opportunist, and he probably would have been very successful if he hadn't been insane. Guiteau had tried everything, and he had failed at everything. He had tried law, evangelism, even a free love commune, and he had failed even there. The women in the commune had nicknamed him Charles Get Out. But he survived on sheer audacity. He traveled all over the country by train, never buying a ticket. He took great pride in moving from boarding house to boarding house and slipping out when the rent was due. And even when he occasionally worked as a bill collector, he just kept whatever he managed to collect. After the Republican convention, Guiteau became obsessed with Garfield. And immediately after the election, he began stalking him. He went to the White House nearly every day. He would sit outside in a park bench day after day waiting for Garfield to come out. At one point, he even walked into the president's office while Garfield was in it. And then he attended a reception where he met the First Lady. He shook her hand, he gave her his card, and he carefully pronounced his name so she wouldn't forget it. It was like a Hitchcock movie. It was incredibly creepy and absolutely terrifying. Finally, Guiteau had what he believed was a divine inspiration. God wanted him to kill the president. It was nothing personal, he would later say, simply God's will. As strange and fascinating and nearly as dangerous as Guiteau was Senator Roscoe Conkling. Conkling was a vain, preening, brutally powerful machine politician who appointed himself Garfield's enemy. He used to wear canary yellow waistcoats, and he would write in lavender ink, and he had, as you can see, a great spit curl in the middle of his forehead, and he recoiled at the slightest touch. In fact, his vanity was so outsized that he was famously ridiculed for it by another congressman on the floor of Congress. But Conkling was no joke. He was dangerously powerful. As a senior senator from New York, he controlled the New York Customs House, which was then the largest federal office in the United States and controlled 70% of the country's entire customs revenue. Conkling tightly controlled patronage in his state, and he expected complete and unquestioning loyalty. In fact, his apartment in New York was known as the Morgue. Conkling was enraged when his candidate, former President Ulysses S. Grant, didn't win the nomination. But he was apoplectic when he realized that he couldn't control Garfield. To Conkling, the attempt on Garfield's life was his ticket back into power. But for the first time in Conkling's life, nothing turned out as he had planned. Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was Garfield's vice president, but he was Conkling's man. Politically, he was completely Conkling's creation. In fact, the only other political office he had held before Vice President of the United States was as the controller of the New York Customs House, a job that Conkling, through Grant, had given to him. In this position, he made as much money as the president, and he never showed up for work before noon. Arthur preferred a life of leisure. He liked fine clothes, old wine, late dinner parties, and he was nearly as preening as Conkling. In fact, he even moved his birth date back a year to appear more youthful. Even within the Republican Party, Arthur's nomination to the vice presidency was considered a ridiculous burlesque. After the election, Arthur continued to make it clear where his loyalties lay. He took vacations with Conkling, he even lived with Conkling in New York, and he took every opportunity to publicly criticize the president. And then suddenly, everything changed. After Garfield was shot, Arthur made a transformation so stunning and complete that no one could believe it. The entire country was horrified at the thought that Chester Arthur might be president. But unlike Conkling, Arthur was grief-stricken and devastated by the shooting. The last thing he wanted was for Garfield to die. He hid himself from public view. He refused even to go to Washington for fear that it would look like he was waiting in the wings, and he cut himself off from Conkling. Finally, after turning his back on the man who had made him, Arthur found moral strength in the most unlikely of places, the letters of a young invalid woman named Julia Sand. Sand believed in Arthur when no one else did, when he didn't even believe in himself. After the shooting, Sand wrote to Arthur, "If there is a spark of true nobility in you, now is the occasion to let it shine. Faith in your better nature forces me to write to you, but not to ask you to resign. Do what is more difficult and more brave, reform." And to everyone's amazement, not least of all his own, Arthur did. He changed dramatically, and he tried to be the president Garfield would have been had he lived. Arthur became not a great president, but an honest and respected one. And not only did he keep Julia Sand's letters, but he wrote back to her, and he even went to see her as president. Sand was at her brother's house after Sunday dinner one day when this gleaming presidential carriage pulled up, and out stepped the President of the United States, who had come to thank her in person. The reason Arthur became president was not Guiteau's madness or Conkling's political maneuverings, but the ambition, ignorance, and dangerous arrogance of the man who assumed control of Garfield's medical care, Dr. Willard Bliss. That's right. His first name was Doctor. His parents had named him Doctor. Bliss was a well-known surgeon with a profitable practice, and he had even been one of the doctors at Abraham Lincoln's deathbed. But he had far from a sterling reputation. He had enthusiastically sold something called Kundurango, which was supposed to cure cancer, syphilis, ulcers, chronic blood diseases, you name it. Bliss had been disgraced for taking bribes, and he had even spent a brief time in prison. When Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, Garfield's Secretary of War, sent for Bliss after the shooting, Bliss saw in this national tragedy a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for fame and power. He immediately took charge of the president's medical care, even though no one had given him authority. He just took it. He dismissed the other doctors, and he completely isolated Garfield in a room in the White House. He wouldn't even let him see his Secretary of State. And what happened in that room inside the White House is nothing short of horrifying. Bliss and the few surgeons he handpicked to help him inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments in Garfield's back again and again, day after day, searching for Guiteau's bullet. The last thing Bliss wanted was for Garfield to die. He had too much at stake, but he was slowly and excruciatingly killing the president. The only hope for Garfield was to find the bullet and end the search, but this was 14 years before the invention of the medical X-ray. What happened next is nothing short of incredible. Only the most brazen novelist would make it up. None other than Alexander Graham Bell stepped forward to help. Bell, a young, restless genius, had invented the telephone just 5 years before when he was only 29 years old. By 1881, the telephone had earned him some money and a lot of fame, but he wanted nothing to do with the company that had grown up around it. He said it was hateful to him at all times and that it fettered him as an inventor. Worse even than the business itself were the lawsuits against it. There were 600 lawsuits against the Bell telephone, 5 of which made it to the United States Supreme Court. Finally, Bell had enough. He said he was sick of the telephone and he quit the Bell Telephone Company. Bell just wanted to help people. He had lost both of his brothers to tuberculosis before he was 24 years old. Both his wife and his mother were deaf, and he knew that he could make life better for people, maybe even save lives. But he worked so hard that his wife and his parents were terrified that he would literally work himself to death. When he was working, he wouldn't stop to eat or rest. His only respite was to play the piano deep into the night. But even then, he played with such an intensity that his mother, who had taught him to play, called it a musical fever. When Garfield was shot, Bell turned his life upside down to try to help him. It sickened him to think of Garfield's doctors blindly searching for the bullet. Science, he thought, should be able to do better than that. Bell abandoned everything he was doing and invented something called an induction balance, which he worked on night and day for months. It was basically a metal detector connected to a telephone receiver, which he ran slowly over the president's body, listening for a telltale buzzing sound that would tell him where the bullet was located. In the end, Bell and science were defeated, but not because the invention didn't work. It did work, and it went on to save countless lives before the invention of the medical X-ray. Alexander Graham Bell was defeated by the president's own doctors. As I began my research for this book, the question that kept coming to me was, how could this have happened? What I found, first of all, was that the presidency in 1881 was very different from the presidency today. First of all, the Secret Service. This is 16 years after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and there was still no Secret Service protection for the president. In fact, Garfield had no protection at all beyond an aging police officer and his 23-year-old private secretary. Not only was the president not protected, but he was expected to interact with the public face-to-face on a daily basis. You have to remember this was the height of the spoils system, and many Americans believed that not only were they entitled to government jobs, but they should be able to make their case for those jobs directly to the president himself. Garfield was forced to meet with office seekers from 10:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. every day, and the situation made him desperate. He longed for time to work and think, and he wondered why anyone would ever want to be president. But while he found office seekers tiresome and even maddening, he never considered them dangerous. He said that assassination could no more be guarded against than death by lightning, and it's best not to worry about either. Garfield rode his horse and walked all around the city by himself all the time. One night, he left the White House. He walked down the street to his Secretary of State's house, and the two men walked alone through the streets of Washington with Guiteau following them the entire way, holding a loaded gun. In fact, by that point, Guiteau had been stalking the president for weeks. He had even followed him to church, where he had considered shooting him. Finally, he made his decision. The president, he knew, would be at the Baltimore and Potomac train station on the morning of July 2nd, 1881, and Guiteau would be waiting. The moment Garfield walked into the train station, Guiteau stepped out of the shadows and shot him twice. The first bullet hit the president in the arm, and the second ripped through his back. By an incredible stroke of luck, however, the bullet that tore through his back didn't kill him. Today, Garfield would have spent at most a few nights in the hospital. Even if he had just been left alone, he almost certainly would have survived. The bullet didn't hit his spinal cord, and it didn't hit any vital organs. It just went behind his pancreas, where it would insist. Unfortunately for Garfield and the nation, Dr. Bliss stepped in. Bliss took advantage of the fear and the chaos surrounding the president's shooting to assume control of Garfield's medical care. But he was not only ambitious and arrogant, he adhered to the most traditional medical methods of the time. Bliss gave Garfield, a gunshot victim, rich foods and alcohol. He took great satisfaction in what he referred to as the healthy pus issuing from the president's wound. And he avoided any treatment that he considered to be new and radical, including antisepsis. The renowned British surgeon Joseph Lister had discovered antisepsis 16 years earlier, and the death rate in his own surgical ward had plummeted dramatically. He had traveled all around the world, begging doctors to sterilize their hands and instruments, and warning them that if they didn't, they ran the very real risk of killing their patients. By 1881, antisepsis was widely accepted in Europe. The most experienced and respected doctors in the United States, however, dismissed it as useless, even dangerous. Some still didn't really even believe in germs, and they certainly didn't want to go to all the trouble that antisepsis required to kill them. They took great pride in what they called the good old surgical stink. They wouldn't change or wash their surgical aprons because they thought the more blood and pus encrusted on them, the more experience it showed. Even those who tried antisepsis had little luck for reasons that today seem painfully apparent. They would sterilize their surgical knives, but if they dropped them during surgery, they would just pick them up and continue to use them. If they needed both hands during surgery, they would hold the knife in their teeth and then continue to use it. Even Alexander Graham Bell could not outrace the infection that was coursing through Garfield's body. The story, however, doesn't end there. Garfield's death brought about tremendous changes in medicine, in politics, in the very fabric of our nation. As soon as Garfield's autopsy report was released, the American people understood that their president didn't have to die, and they understood why he did. Bliss was publicly disgraced, and antisepsis was immediately accepted and practiced across the country. Americans turned their rage and their grief on the political system that had encouraged a madman like Guiteau. Chester Arthur himself, who owed his entire career to patronage, signed the Pendleton Act, which was the beginning of the end of the spoil system. Garfield's death also brought the country together in a way that had not been seen since the Civil War. Lincoln's assassination had only deepened that divide, but Garfield had been the first president since the Civil War to be accepted as the leader of the whole country, North and South, immigrant and pioneer, freedman and former slave owner. His death was their loss, and their common grief brought them together. Above all, Garfield's death changed the presidency itself. You could argue that this really marked the end of the idealistic or perhaps naive concept of the president alone meeting with office seekers, personally making appointments at every level of government. It was obviously an unworkable system for many reasons. It was open to corruption, it was completely inefficient, and it was personally dangerous. And it never would have worked as the United States grew into a world power. And it's good that it's gone. But at the same time, these changes also make it almost impossible to ever again elect someone like Garfield. The presidency today is not about a single person, but about a large, complex institution. The presidency is too big and too distant for Americans to be able to choose someone who isn't even trying to be elected. We have hopefully outgrown the day when a madman could just walk into the Oval Office, and when an incompetent doctor could seize control of the White House for nearly 3 months, killing the president in the process. But we likely have also outgrown the day when Americans could recognize the promise of a fine, honest man, a man with no financial support, no political machine, just the strength of his own words and ideas, and in a shining moment of democracy, make him our leader. Thank you.